Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about demonic traits in friends and family, it's important to clarify that we're not referring to supernatural entities. Instead, we're pointing to destructive behavioral patterns that manifest in people we know intimately, often subtly, often chronically. These traits are not random. They are rooted in predictable neuropsychological mechanisms. To understand them, we must first understand how the brain processes stress, trauma, social threat, and emotional regulation. The brain is a predictive organ. It attempts to model the environment, anticipate outcomes, and regulate the body's response to internal and external stimuli. When someone has been exposed to chronic stress, early development, mental trauma, or persistent emotional neglect, the neural circuitry responsible for emotional regulation and decision-making can become maladaptive. This means it functions in a way that no longer serves optimal psychological health or relational harmony. What appears on the surface as controlling, narcissistic, manipulative, or emotionally volatile behavior often stems from deep, unresolved dysregulation in the brain. At the center of this is the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus. These regions are responsible for detecting threat and forming emotional memories. In individuals who exhibit demonic traits, again, we're speaking metaphorically, we often find an overactive amygdala. This overactivation leads to hypersensitivity to perceived social threats, rejection, or loss of control. When the amygdala dominates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision, making empathy and long-term planning is suppressed. This results in impulsive, emotionally driven behaviors that often hurt others. For example, someone who frequently lashes out, blames others, or engages in manipulative behavior may be stuck in a neurological loop where their amygdala is on high alert, scanning for danger or betrayal, even when none exists. Their neurochemistry is tilted towards survival rather than connection. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, remains elevated in such individuals, compromising their ability to access logical, future-oriented thinking. In a very literal sense, their brain is stuck in the past, replaying old scripts from earlier emotional wounds. Dopamine pathways also play a significant role in the behavior of such individuals. Many of the traits associated with so-called demons in our social circles, manipulation, emotional volatility, dominance, compulsive lying, are reinforced by short-term dopamine hits. If a person learns early on that lying helps them avoid punishment, or that explosive behavior gives them control in a chaotic household, those patterns get rewarded neurologically. Over time, the brain wires itself to expect dopamine from these toxic interactions. What begins as a coping mechanism becomes a personality feature. In this context, it's essential to understand that the brain is plastic. It molds itself in response to repeated experiences. When someone grows up in an environment that is unstable, unloving, or inconsistent, their internal model of relationships becomes distorted. They may unconsciously believe that control equals love, or that vulnerability leads to pain. These belief systems get encoded not just psychologically, but biologically. The neural networks that underlie their sense of safety, identity, and connection become interwoven with fear and dominance. This isn't to say people aren't responsible for their actions. They are. But it explains why some individuals seem to repeatedly sabotage relationships, create chaos, or weaponize guilt. Their nervous system is calibrated to expect danger and disappointment, and their behaviors are often an attempt to regain a sense of control. The problem is that these behaviors frequently harm others, especially those closest to them. What makes these patterns particularly hard to detect is their subtlety. Demonic traits don't always come across as dramatic outbursts. Often, they manifest as chronic passive aggressiveness, triangulation pitting people against each other, or a refusal to acknowledge harm done. These traits are strategic adaptations, evolved responses to environments where more direct, honest expression wasn't safe. Over time, they solidify into fixed traits, reinforced by a brain that believes it must act this way to survive. Understanding this neuropsychological underpinning helps shift the question from why are they like this to what is their nervous system protecting them from. This reframing doesn't excuse the behavior, but it allows us to see it with greater clarity and detachment. Once we recognize these traits as maladaptive neural loop, rooted in a dysregulated brain trying to manage its internal chaos, we can make more informed decisions about how to interact, set boundaries, or disengage altogether. Nonverbal red flags often tell us far more about a person's inner state than their words ever will. When evaluating the presence of toxic or demonic traits, again, using the term metaphorically, in friends and family, paying close attention to body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, and physiological cues becomes essential. These nonverbal signals are tightly connected to the autonomic nervous system ANS, which operates below the level of conscious control and regulates everything from heart rate and digestion to emotional reactivity and social engagement. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two main branches, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic branch is often described as the fight or flight system, activating during perceived threats or danger. The parasympathetic system is associated with rest and digest states and is essential for calm, recovery, and relational connection. In a regulated individual, these two systems work in a dynamic balance, adjusting based on environmental demands. But in individuals with deeply embedded psychological stress or unresolved trauma, this balance is often disrupted. That disruption is visible in how they carry themselves, how they interact, and how their body unconsciously reacts during moments of stress, confrontation, or even intimacy. One of the most telling nonverbal indicators is facial tension. People who frequently tighten their jaw, clench their teeth, or exhibit shallow frowning even in neutral conversation are often operating under a heightened sympathetic load. The facial muscles, particularly those around the eyes and mouth, are innervated by cranial nerves that interact with deeper brain regions responsible for emotional regulation. When the nervous system is dysregulated, these muscles exhibit chronic tension, an outward manifestation of inward stress. In practical terms, if someone's resting face looks angry, suspicious, or guarded, even when there's no immediate reason for it, it may indicate a nervous system that's locked in a defensive state. Another major red flag is erratic or inconsistent eye contact. Individuals with toxic behavioral patterns often shift between extremes, prolonged, overly intense stares and sudden avoidance. These shifts are not merely personality quirks. They reflect instability in the neurophysiological systems that regulate social engagement. The vagus nerve, which is part of the parasympathetic system, plays a role in what's known as the social engagement system. When someone is regulated and safe, eye contact tends to be steady and reciprocal. But when someone's system is either hyper-aroused or shut down, eye contact can become predatory, avoidant, or disjointed. It's not the duration of eye contact that matters, but the quality, whether it feels connective or invasive. Breathing patterns are another key indicator of autonomic state. Rapid, shallow chest breathing signals sympathetic activation. In contrast, slow, diaphragmatic breathing is a hallmark of parasympathetic dominance. People who frequently sigh, hold their breath, or seem unable to regulate their respiration during normal conversation are often stuck in a loop of nervous system dysregulation. This isn't always visible, but in close, repeated interactions, these patterns emerge. They point to someone who may be in a constant state of underlying tension or emotional readiness for conflict or control. Posture also provides critical information. Someone who regularly crosses their arms, leans away when being spoken to, or keeps their hands tightly clenched is often unconsciously protecting themselves. These behaviors reflect defensive posturing that the body adopts when it feels unsafe, even if the context is socially neutral or warm. On the flip side, individuals who invade personal space, use intimidating gestures, or orient their body to dominate a room are often projecting a sympathetic override, an attempt to assert control in situations that unconsciously feel threatening to them. Tone of voice, cadence, and pitch shifts are further extensions of autonomic activity. A voice that fluctuates unpredictably in tone, volume, or rhythm can be a sign of underlying emotional chaos. The human voice is modulated by breath and tension in the throat and chest, all areas directly influenced by the state of the nervous system. Individuals whose voice often carries a subtle edge, sarcasm, or aggressive undercurrent may be operating from a chronic fight or flight state. They may not even be aware of it, but the body reveals what the mind suppresses. When you repeatedly notice these nonverbal cues in some tight facial muscles, vigilant eyes, disordered breathing, rigid posture, and vocal unpredictability, it's not just a matter of personality. It's evidence of a nervous system that is not in a state of safety or connection. These behaviors tend to precede or accompany toxic interpersonal dynamics, particularly when combined with defensiveness, control, or emotional manipulation. Their origin is not mysterious. They are rooted in specific physiological systems that are dysregulated over time due to trauma, emotional neglect, or learned survival strategies in unsafe environments. The autonomic nervous system, in this sense, acts like a broadcast tower for psychological distress, even when no words are spoken. Patterns of manipulation and gaslighting are among the most psychologically damaging behaviors one can encounter in close relationships. While these behaviors often present as calculated or malicious, they are typically rooted in deeper dysfunctions of the brain's emotional and cognitive systems, particularly those involved in threat detection, memory, empathy, and impulse control. To understand how and why people close to us might engage in these patterns, we need to examine the neurobiological underpinnings that drive them. Manipulation is not just a behavioral strategy. It's often a defensive mechanism developed early in life when more direct or healthy means of getting needs met were either unavailable or punished. When someone learns, for example, that vulnerability leads to rejection or that honesty results in punishment, they may develop covert methods of controlling others as a form of self-protection. Over time, these methods become habitual, ingrained not only in thought but in neural circuitry. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and ethical reasoning, becomes wired to prioritize short-term gains and self-protection over long-term relational trust. Gaslighting, a particularly insidious form of manipulation, involves the deliberate or unconscious distortion of another person's perception of reality. The person doing the gaslighting often denies obvious facts, rewrites history, or minimizes the other's emotional responses in order to maintain control or avoid accountability. This tactic relies heavily on an individual's ability to override empathy and engage in cognitive dissonance, functions regulated by the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. When these brain regions are underactive or poorly integrated due to chronic stress or early developmental trauma, the ability to accurately perceive and respond to another person's emotional state is diminished. The result is a form of interpersonal relating that feels cold, calculated, and destabilizing to the recipient. In individuals who consistently use manipulation or gaslighting, there's often a dysregulation in the limbic system, particularly in the amygdala. This area of the brain is responsible for detecting threats and generating emotional responses. In someone with a hyperactive amygdala, neutral situations may be perceived as threatening. When that happens, the brain defaults to defensive strategies: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Manipulation and gaslighting can be seen as extensions of the fawn response, where the goal is not to confront danger directly, but to covertly control the environment to reduce perceived threats. This can include controlling other people's emotional states, decisions, and even their memories. Neurochemically, these behaviors are often reinforced by short-term dopamine and adrenaline spikes when a manipulative tactic succeeds, when the person gets what they want or avoids consequences. This outcome releases dopamine in the brain's reward pathways, particularly in the nucleus accumbens. That positive feedback loop encourages the repetition of the behavior, reinforcing the idea that deception and control are effective strategies. Over time, this becomes the default operating mode. These individuals may not even consciously recognize their actions as manipulative because the brain has been conditioned to view such behavior as both necessary and effective. There is also often a marked deficit in oxytocin signaling in individuals who gaslight or manipulate regularly. Oxytocin is sometimes referred to as the bonding hormone because it facilitates trust, empathy, and social cohesion. Lower oxytocin activity has been associated with increased social distrust and reduced capacity for guilt or emotional connection. This may explain why people who gaslight can maintain a calm demeanor even while causing significant psychological harm to someone they claim to love. Their brain is not registering the other's pain in a typical empathic way. Language also plays a central role in manipulation and gaslighting. The person engaging in these behaviors often uses carefully structured communication tactics, vague phrasing, strategic interruptions, sudden emotional shifts, or calculated silence. These linguistic techniques are processed in brain areas like Broca's and Wernicke's areas, but more importantly, they reflect a disconnect between language and genuine emotional processing. Instead of using language to connect or share truth, it is weaponized to destabilize the listener's sense of certainty and autonomy. This use of language to alter perception and shift blame serves a regulatory function for the manipulator. It soothes their internal chaos by externalizing it, placing confusion, doubt, or guilt into the other person's mind. Victims of these behaviors often find themselves questioning their own memory, judgment, and emotions. This is not accidental. Gaslighting and manipulation, when sustained over time, can alter the victim's brain function as well. Repeated experiences of being invalidated or disoriented can activate the stress response system chronically, keeping cortisol levels elevated and impairing hippocampal function, which plays a key role in memory consolidation. As a result, the victim's ability to trust their own narrative becomes compromised, making them more susceptible to further control. The manipulative person, often unknowingly, is engaging in a type of neurological war. They're using their words, body language, and emotional reactions to create a reality that serves their internal need for control and safety at the expense of the other's psychological integrity. This isn't simply a matter of bad character or poor communication. It reflects a maladaptive pattern deeply woven into their neurobiology, shaped by early experiences and continuously reinforced by their environment and relationships. Emotional contagion is a powerful and often overlooked mechanism through which moods, emotions, and even psychological states are transmitted from one person to another. It operates largely beneath the surface of conscious awareness, and it is especially potent in close relationships. This phenomenon is not just a poetic idea. It is rooted in the biology of the brain, specifically within the mirror neuron system and the broader neurophysiological architecture that governs empathy, social awareness, and emotional regulation. The mirror neuron system was first discovered in the premotor cortex of macaque monkeys, where specific neurons were observed firing both when the monkey performed an action and when it observed another doing the same action. In humans, this system is more complex and integrated, involving areas such as the inferior frontal gyrus and the inferior parietal lobule. These neurons play a foundational role in allowing us to understand the actions and intentions of others, but they also contribute to a more subtle and psychologically potent process, the internal simulation of other people's emotions. When you see someone cry, grimace, laugh, or tense up in anger, your brain doesn't just register that event intellectually. It mirrors it internally, the mirror neuron system activates corresponding emotional states within your own neural circuitry. If someone near you is anxious, irritable, or emotionally unstable, you begin to feel those emotions, not necessarily because of what is being said or done directly to you, but because your brain is synchronizing with the emotional signals in your environment. This process is magnified in close relationships or when the individual displaying the emotion holds psychological authority, such as a parent, spouse, or close friend. Emotional contagion becomes particularly relevant when discussing demonic behavioral patterns, the metaphorical reference to individuals who seem to leave others feeling drained, confused, anxious, or off balance after prolonged contact. These individuals often emit a kind of emotional static that hijacks the nervous systems of those around them. They may not be yelling or explicitly antagonistic. In fact, many people with these patterns present as calm or composed on the surface. But beneath that exterior is a storm of unresolved emotion, often leaking out through micro expressions, vocal tone, body posture, or energy that others can feel but not always describe. This leak of emotion creates an ambient stress signal that your mirror neuron system picks up and internalizes. Your own body may begin to display signs of anxiety, tight chest, shallow breathing, a racing mind, without any overt provocation. The autonomic nervous system responds as if you are under threat, even though the threat is interpersonal and implicit. This is the cost of prolonged exposure to dysregulated emotional environments. The nervous system becomes conditioned to stay on high alert, anticipating shifts in mood, tone, or behavior from someone who is psychologically unstable or manipulative. Cortisol and other stress hormones play a significant role in this process. When you unconsciously absorb the emotions of another, your body's stress response becomes activated, even if no external danger exists. Over time, this can lead to emotional exhaustion, burnout, and reduced capacity for clear thinking and emotional regulation. What's more, individuals who exhibit demonic traits often have a finely tuned ability, conscious or not, to project their inner chaos onto others, making it feel like you are the problem, you are unstable, or you are overly sensitive. This is where emotional contagion intersects with psychological manipulation, creating a feedback loop that is both neurologically taxing and psychologically confusing. There is also a resonance effect facilitated by limbic synchrony. In emotionally charged situations, the limbic systems of two people can begin to operate in tandem. This is a biological basis for empathy, but in toxic dynamics, it becomes a channel for dysfunction. The emotionally dysregulated individual essentially uses the nervous system of another person to stabilize themselves. You may notice, for example, that when you become calm or emotionally grounded, they start to offload their tension onto you, either through subtle provocation or by emotionally unloading without your consent. Your emotional regulation becomes the ground they walk on, but at a significant cost to your own mental health. People with strong mirror neuron system responses are often more empathic, intuitive, and emotionally intelligent. But these same qualities make them more susceptible to emotional contagion in toxic relationships. This is especially dangerous when combined with chronic exposure to someone whose nervous system is consistently in a state of hyperarousal, fear, or control, seeking behavior. Over time, the constant mirroring of another person's dysfunction reshapes your own baseline emotional state, leading to learned helplessness, chronic stress, or even dissociation. The boundary between where their emotional experience ends and yours becomes blurred, not because of a lack of awareness, but because your brain is wired to reflect, absorb, and adapt to the emotional energy around you. Understanding the mirror neuron system in the context of emotional contagion reveals how deeply interconnected human beings are not just socially, but biologically. The state of another person's nervous system can become an invasive force in your own, particularly when repeated interactions occur without healthy boundaries or emotional reciprocity. This makes it critical to recognize the emotional atmosphere others generate, not only in terms of what they say or do, but in terms of how your body feels after interacting with them, and how your thoughts and emotions shift in their presence. Inconsistency in moral reasoning and the tendency to violate boundaries are hallmark traits in individuals who repeatedly create emotional turmoil in close relationships. These patterns are not simply character flaws or the result of poor upbringing. They are deeply embedded in the neurocognitive and emotional architecture of the brain. When someone exhibits these behaviors chronically, it reflects disruptions in the circuits responsible for empathy, moral cognition, impulse control, and the recognition of personal autonomy, both their own and that of others. Moral reasoning is governed in large part by the prefrontal cortex, specifically the ventromedial and dorsolateral regions. These areas are responsible for weighing outcomes, understanding social rules, and applying ethical principles consistently across contexts. In a well-regulated brain, moral judgment tends to be stable. A person applies similar standards to themselves as they do to others, but in those with unstable or toxic relational patterns, this system often fails to operate with integrity. They may harshly judge others for mistakes they themselves frequently make or excuse their own harmful behavior as necessary while condemning others for far less. This inconsistency is not just hypocrisy, it is a functional distortion in the neuropsychological machinery that processes social and moral information. What often drives this distortion is an underlying fragility in identity. When the self is not secure, when someone has not developed a stable internal compass for right and wrong, their moral reasoning becomes reactive, situation dependent, and highly personalized. They make moral evaluations based not on ethical consistency, but on how the situation impacts their sense of control, status, or emotional comfort. If acknowledging wrongdoing would require them to experience guilt, shame, or vulnerability, they reflexively reject it. This is a protective function of the ego, but it is enacted through neural pathways designed for emotional regulation and social threat detection. The amygdala, which detects perceived threats to social standing or emotional security, becomes overactive, overwhelming the prefrontal circuits that would normally apply fairness or ethical reflection. As a result, they may flip their moral stance from one interaction to the next, depending entirely on whether it serves their psychological self-preservation. Closely tied to this is the violation of boundaries, emotional, physical, and psychological. Boundary violation is not always overt or aggressive. It can be subtle, persistent, and enacted through small transgressions that accumulate over time. Individuals who engage in boundary violations often lack an integrated sense of where they end and others begin. This is rooted in impaired functioning of the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in self-awareness and emotional resonance. When these brain regions are underdeveloped or dysregulated, the person may struggle to sense or respect the internal states of others. They are neurologically impaired in their capacity to differentiate their needs and emotions from those around them, and therefore feel entitled to access or control others' emotional spaces as if they were extensions of themselves. This blurring of emotional boundaries often shows up as invasive questioning, unsolicited advice, guilt, tripping, or chronic overstepping of relational norms. Even when they are told directly that a line has been crossed, they may minimize the impact or rationalize the intrusion as being well-intentioned. That rationalization process is another cognitive distortion rooted in frontal lobe dysfunction, where reasoning is filtered through self, serving logic rather than mutual respect or empathy. Over time, these small violations wear down the psychological defenses of the people around them, fostering confusion, resentment, and often a gradual erosion of the victim's sense of agency. What makes these patterns particularly dangerous is that they are often cloaked in apparent normalcy or even kindness. The individual may present as helpful, insightful, or attentive, all while covertly undermining the autonomy of those around them. This inconsistency between behavior and intention creates a cognitive dissonance in the people affected by it. The brain of the person on the receiving end must reconcile the verbal claims of goodwill with the felt experience of being controlled, disrespected, or emotionally manipulated. This dissonance taxes the nervous system, often leading to hypervigilance, chronic stress, or emotional withdrawal. People who violate boundaries and display inconsistent moral reasoning are often operating from a framework of emotional survival. They manipulate moral standards and personal space as tools to regulate their own inner instability. They are not grounded in stable ethics or relational mutuality, but instead use shifting standards and fluid boundaries to maintain psychological equilibrium, especially in moments of perceived threat or emotional vulnerability. These behaviors are often learned early in life, in environments where boundaries were either non-existent or inconsistently enforced, and where moral standards were applied arbitrarily or manipulatively. The brain adapts to such environments by developing flexible, self-serving cognitive schemas that can be deployed in real time to avoid shame, deflect blame, or secure control. Chronic victimhood and projection function as defensive mechanisms that are deeply embedded in the neural and psychological architecture of individuals who struggle with emotional regulation, self-concept, and interpersonal boundaries. These behaviors do not emerge randomly. They are complex adaptations to early life experiences that train the brain to interpret the world through a lens of perpetual threat, unprocessed shame, and externalized responsibility. While these defense mechanisms can present in subtle, socially acceptable forms, over time they often corrode trust, emotional safety, and the capacity for healthy connection in close relationships. Chronic victimhood is not merely a behavioral habit, but a cognitive and emotional stance that becomes deeply internalized. It reflects a world shaped by real or perceived injustices that were never resolved or validated. In the brain, the structures most involved in this pattern include the amygdala, which monitors for threat and emotional salience, and the hippocampus, which encodes emotional memory. When these regions are chronically activated by stress or trauma, especially in early developmental periods, they prime the individual to be hypersensitive to perceived slights, rejections, or unfair treatment in the present. Over time, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for reflective thought and cognitive reappraisal, is trained not to challenge these interpretations, but to reinforce them. The result is a default narrative that casts the self as the frequent target of harm and others as either aggressors or enablers. This narrative is further supported by the brain's reward system. When someone receives attention, comfort, or moral leverage by presenting as a victim, the dopamine pathways in the mesolimbic system are activated, creating a sense of temporary relief or validation. That emotional payoff can condition the behavior to repeat, especially if the person has not developed more adaptive strategies for emotional expression, boundary setting, or conflict resolution. In social interactions, this can look like the repeated recounting of personal grievances, the tendency to redirect group attention toward their suffering, or the inability to acknowledge the impact of their own behavior on others. Their emotional needs become the unspoken center of gravity in relationships, often displacing mutuality and accountability. Projection, on the other hand, is a psychological mechanism whereby an individual attributes their own unacceptable feelings, motives, or behaviors to another person. At the neurobiological level, this is often a result of impaired self-awareness and disrupted emotional processing, particularly within the insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. These regions are responsible for internal monitoring, tracking emotional states and integrating them into a coherent sense of self. When this system is underactive or overwhelmed, the brain may default to externalizing distress. Feelings of anger, shame, envy, or insecurity that cannot be consciously tolerated are disowned and seen instead in the behavior of others. In interpersonal dynamics, projection often manifests as accusations that are disconnected from observable reality but carry intense emotional charge. A person may accuse others of being manipulative, selfish, cold, or controlling when those are the very traits they struggle to own within themselves. This process is typically unconscious. The individual truly believes their perception is accurate as the brain's threat detection systems, particularly the amygdala, are reinforcing the narrative with emotional urgency. Logical reasoning and empathetic dialogue become difficult or impossible because the prefrontal cortex is not adequately regulating emotional input, leading to black and white thinking and relational instability. When chronic victimhood and projection are operating simultaneously, they create a closed psychological loop that is extremely difficult to break. The individual interprets most interpersonal challenges as proof of persecution, and any attempt to provide feedback or accountability is reframed as further victimization. Projection shields them from having to examine their role in conflict, while the victim narrative protects them from the pain of shame or powerlessness. Over time, this dynamic can lead to a breakdown in relational reciprocity as those around them begin to feel blamed, misunderstood, or emotionally exploited. Another layer of complexity arises when these behaviors are reinforced by early attachment patterns. Individuals with insecure or disorganized attachment often experienced caregivers who were unpredictable, emotionally unavailable, or punitive. In such an environment, expressing vulnerability could be dangerous, and taking responsibility might lead to punishment or withdrawal of love. In this context, victimhood becomes a safer emotional posture than ownership, and projection becomes a tool for avoiding relational rupture by keeping shame at a psychological distance. These early experiences shape the neural templates for adult relationships, leading to persistent defensive postures that prioritize psychological survival over authenticity and connection. The net effect of these mechanisms is a form of emotional displacement. Rather than metabolizing painful emotions internally and using them as signals for growth or change, the individual disperses them into their environment, into the minds and bodies of those closest to them. Friends, family members, and partners often find themselves walking on eggshells, unable to predict emotional reactions, or feeling as though they are constantly at fault without understanding why. The chronic use of these defenses eventually erodes the trust and safety required for intimacy, leaving the individual isolated or surrounded by enablers who reinforce their narrative at the expense of their own well-being. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to adapt, rewire, and form new neural connections in response to experience, plays a central role in the process of disentangling from toxic relationships and choosing to disconnect from individuals who chronically undermine emotional safety. While the emotional and psychological gravity of long-standing relationships, particularly those with family or close friends, can make the idea of separation feel unnatural or even dangerous, the biological truth is that change is not only possible but necessary when patterns of interaction begin to erode one's mental health and nervous system stability. The human brain is inherently relational. From infancy, neural development is shaped through co-regulation with caregivers. Mirror neurons, limbic resonance, and the architecture of attachment all contribute to the way we learn to feel safe, seen, and regulated. These early patterns of emotional connection become hardwired into the default mode network and influence how we interpret safety, threat, and intimacy well into adulthood. When these early relationships are marked by inconsistency, emotional neglect, manipulation, or enmeshment, the nervous system learns to adapt not by seeking out peace or authenticity, but by staying hyper, attuned to relational volatility. This wiring can make disconnection from toxic relationships feel counterintuitive because chaos feels familiar and familiarity is often mistaken for safety. Neuroplasticity offers a path out of this loop. The process of deliberate disconnection begins by forming new associations in the brain, recognizing that stability, peace, and emotional clarity are not signs of weakness or abandonment, but indicators of a regulated nervous system and healthy boundaries. When an individual begins to notice how their body feels around certain people, tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, anxious thoughts, or internal dissociation, they are accessing interoceptive signals that the insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex generate in response to threat. Choosing to distance oneself from people who repeatedly trigger these responses is not avoidance but recalibration. It is the nervous system learning a new baseline for what safe connection actually feels like. This process is often complicated by emotional residue, guilt, shame, fear of judgment, and the internalized belief that maintaining connection at all costs is a moral obligation. These feelings are real, but they are also learned. The brain holds onto relational patterns not because they are beneficial, but because they are familiar. Neural networks that fire together wire together. Thus, the more often someone rationalizes boundary violations, forgives manipulation, or tolerates gaslighting, the more entrenched those patterns become. Disconnection, then, is not just a psychological act. It is an active rewiring of the brain's schema for what relationships are supposed to feel like. Functional MRI studies show that when individuals practice cognitive reappraisal, intentionally reframing a situation to see it from a different perspective, the prefrontal cortex becomes more active while the amygdala becomes less reactive. This is a critical shift. In the context of toxic relationships, it means developing the capacity to interpret emotional distancing not as cruelty or betrayal, but as self-preservation and neurobiological alignment. With repeated practice, this shift in interpretation becomes the foundation for new relational templates, ones built on consistency, mutual respect, and nervous system safety. The brain does not erase old patterns, it builds new ones on top of them. This means that the tendencies to re-engage, doubt oneself, or feel pulled back into old dynamics are not failures of willpower, but echoes of past wiring. The solution is not suppression, but replacement. New experiences of safe reciprocal connection, whether with friends, mentors, therapists, or through solitude, serve as corrective experiences that encode new relational maps into the brain. Over time, the emotional reward system recalibrates. What once felt normal begins to feel jarring, and what once felt boring, calm, reliable, non-reactive presence begins to feel grounding and essential. Choosing to disconnect requires not just emotional resolve, but a physiological adjustment. The autonomic nervous system, especially the vagus nerve, needs to be engaged in ways that support safety and social connection. Practices like breathwork, mindfulness, cold exposure, and physical exercise help regulate the stress response and provide the somatic foundation for cognitive clarity. This clarity is what allows someone to make and maintain the decision to step away from harmful dynamics, even when those dynamics are masked by familial obligation, shared history, or emotional codependency. When disconnection is pursued not from a place of anger or reactivity, but from an understanding of what the brain and body need to heal, the process becomes less about cutting someone off and more about opening space for integration and regeneration. Over time, the brain adapts. Neural circuits that once lit up in the presence of relational stress begin to go quiet, and new circuits dedicated to peace, agency, and self-trust take their place. This is the neurobiological reality of choosing a different path, one that reflects not only what the mind wants, but what the body and brain require for sustainable well-being and coherent self.